Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. It's my first time at MCE, although I have been in Warsaw before, and I love your city and I love Polish people. We have so many Polish people living in Ireland. You're like, you're adopted in our country. And as I was saying to some people that I met last night, when Ireland failed to qualify in the World Cup in football, all of Ireland voted for Poland, and basically Ireland became it turned Polish for the duration of the World Cup. So, okay, so just very quickly, I am a lecturer in design at the Institute of Art and Design Technology in Dublin, in Ireland. My training is in visual communication, but now I'm heading up the Department of Technology and Psychology. And really, at the college where I teach, we have a range of programs in design, technology, and psychology, all focused on filmmaking, animation, all focused on creating new kind of experiences, digital experiences. So where I'm coming from, I suppose, is I'm really interested in the intersection between design and technology, which leads me to the topic of my talk today. So I'm going to throw this problem out to you, and I'd like you to have a think about it. How do you read today? As digital natives, how do you read today? Do you read predominantly on your phone? Do you read your emails? Do you read your social media? What type of reading do you engage in? And I've been, I suppose, over the last few years between teaching and researching, thinking about the idea of reading. My specialist area, I suppose, is screen typography. But what I found is over the years that my relationship with word-based communication has totally changed. And I don't know if any of you have read this book. Has anybody read this book? Okay. So it really resonated with me, this idea that, our brains have become quite fractured in terms of our approach to information. There's so much information out there, and there's so much information coming at us all the time that, we can't possibly cope with it. And those days of deep reading seem to be gone. We seem to now exist in a very kind of superficial way where we're trying to skim along the surface of this vast information. So I thought this quote from Nicholas Carr, once I was a scuba diver in the sea of words, now I zip along surfaces like a guy on a jet ski. So I guess what I'm going to propose to you today is that today we read very differently than we did in the past, and it's constantly evolving. And I have a concern about word-based communication and about reading and the nature of reading in terms of, I suppose, our ability to focus, retain information, and to think critically. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so just in terms of motivation, I thought it'd be good for you to know where I'm coming from. So I'm a practicing designer, have been for the last 20 years, and most of my work has been around the publishing space. So a couple of years ago, I redesigned Ireland's largest newspaper online. I've also done quite a number of apps. One app you'll be familiar with, and I'll talk about it later, is a poetry app. So as a designer, I suppose my remit has been to try and engage the audiences with text-based communication. And, as the years have gone on, it's getting harder and harder to draw people down into the information. So for example, when I was designing the newspaper, I was working with 4 data scientists who were tracking my every kind of move in terms of the UI and the UX and what audiences were doing. And what I found was, yes, we could manipulate them through the design, but we also found that, people were skimming along the surface. And there's acres and acres of journalism out there that is never read. So that's an interesting statistic. And that all of the focus to draw users in was on the headline, writing the headline. I've also been teaching for 20 years, and again, I've noticed a change in students. I've lost one person already. So what I've noticed as well is students are very impatient, and their ability to kind of, so you give them a reading list and they'll skim across the reading list and they'll put the references, they'll put the sound bites in, but really there is this thing of impatience of trying to get the knowledge faster without actually maybe doing some of the work. So again, it just kind of started to pose questions for me. And again, I have a PhD in screen typography, so I started to look at the design and the structure and the form of lettering on screens and how could that help us in terms of the experience. And then lastly, I have 3 children who are completely what I would call tech savvy and tech mad, and it seems to really motivate them, and they are totally fluid with technology, but they're also very impatient. So again, the challenge for anybody with young children nowadays is trying to keep them in the slow world as well as the fast world, so they stay at pace and learn the basic literacy skills. So just in thinking about the reading experience then, I suppose we have to start by looking at reader behavior, and sort of questioning the audience and the types of behaviors that are existent today. Also want to look at some principles around what I think is the best coming from traditional reading experience and then the digital reading experience. If we crash those together and take the best from both, maybe we have a blueprint going forward. And then I'll mention something a little bit about wish list of what would be great, and what does the future look like. I do want to say that if you're here to find out what the future of reading is, you're at the wrong talk. So there's nothing highly technological about my talk. It's really about people and thinking about how they experience technology. Okay, so let's just have a little look at this picture. So you could say that the people here are both reading, okay? And reading, we all read on the train when we're traveling, and these two pictures are from different places and different eras. But what's interesting about them is they look like they might be doing something similar, yes, and on different devices in different times, in different places. But what's the behavior of what they're actually doing? So if you think about reading on screen today, it's incredibly fast and vast. In this little device that you're holding in your hand, you have this open world underneath where you've access to information, everything from booking a flight to doing your banking to reading a novel to reading a post in the newspaper. So it's multiple. And our approach in terms of our screen media tends to be one that's more productive rather than, I suppose, sitting back, relaxing and reading. So even if we are relaxing on the way to work and we're reading Facebook posts or we're connecting with our friends, we still got this kind of a ping in the background of our email is coming in, so it's what I would say is we're in a different frame of mind when we're reading off the screen. If you compare to print, and you take something like a newspaper or a book that people used to read, sitting on a train. And again, if you take a straw poll, many of you who travel today, I know I did the last time I was in London on the Underground, and practically nobody was reading anything that was paper-based. Everybody was reading their phones or a tablet or an e-reader. But if you take this example, reading a newspaper today, I don't know how many of you have actually read a newspaper recently, like a physical newspaper? Okay, so that's good, a few of you. Can I ask you though, would you view that as being a luxury kind of thing where you sit down with a cup of tea or have a cup of coffee and you sit down, I'll read the newspaper? Does anybody think like that when they read the newspaper? Yes. If you sat down at your desk and work and read the newspaper, what do you think that would look like to your colleagues? You're taking a break, would you say? So our whole perception of the newspaper as an artifact has completely changed. Years ago, the newspaper was an incredibly important artifact in work, and people would go in, they'd scan the daily papers, and you'd get any mentions. It was completely different. So reading the paper was something you had to do at work. Now we read it online, and that's okay. But if we sat down with our desk and with a newspaper and a cup of coffee, people would think, oh, they're just, they're not working. They're just kicking back and having a relax. So our view of traditional media has changed. But print is slow. It's slower. It's more succinct. It's static. It's fixed, and it's singular. So that what you see is what you get. There isn't layers and layers and layers to other worlds, and other grass is greener over here, and there's more and there's more and there's more. So if we think about the reading experience, I propose to you perhaps that when we are involved with digital or screen-based devices, we tend to be reading more in a productive manner. And when we deal with maybe paper-based or leisure reading, we tend to be more contemplative and relaxed. And if we move that along in terms of our activity or our behavior, we tend to do on screen and we tend to read then when it's in print. So I guess the thing I want to ask you then is really, if we think about the culture of reading, what is our culture going forward? Is it a clash? Is it one or the other? Or is it a mashup whereby we have this kind of productive and contemplative reading happening at the same time. And the problem is, do they clash with each other, or is there a way to create new forms of reading that is a mashup of both, that enable us to not be distracted, like I said at the beginning, and skim along the surface, but to maybe do a bit of that and then to go deep. And that's what I want to talk about. So the question is, if we are existing mostly in the digital realm, and we're dealing with, this is where our reading happens across many of these types of apps and sites, are we readers at all? I mean, is the image replacing text-based communication in terms of our consumption of information? So if you think about, anybody who's at this conference, you're all working perhaps in digital technologies, and you're highly educated, you're trying to keep up on your discipline. Where are you getting that information? On your phone, on Twitter, on Pulse, on LinkedIn, on several maybe blogs that you read. So again, and it's fast. You've got to keep up, so you've got to read all these things. So you get a soundbite on Twitter that has a link, and that leads you to an article in a blog, and then you read the blog, and then you think, oh, there's a reference there for a book, and oh, but I don't have time to read the book, but I'll use that reference, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And so it goes on and on and on like this. So the question, I think, is we're overloaded by information, and we have an impatience to consume it, but not to consume it deeply. So it's kind of a little bit like, I think, surfers, And when I was working in the newspaper, there was a lot of research, a lot of audience research, and I came across this term called snackers and gorgers. I don't know if you've heard this. So they were designing a lot of audience research, and profiling the audience into different segments. And they were like, oh, people over 50, they still read the newspaper, they still have that habit, and they're the ones that, they'll skim, but then they'll go deep. And then there's the younger people who just skim, they're only headlines and so on. So it's really interesting, the kind of the tactical strategies that are needed to engage readers today. So I think there's 4 kind of key factors that influence the reading experience. I call them the 4 Ds, and I think that these kind of give us clues about the future. The first is data. So again, as I said, when I was designing the newspaper, I worked with 4 data scientists who basically, they were like a massive thorn in my side, I'll be honest, because as a designer, you tend to work intuitively. And then you have data scientists saying, oh, but the data says no. Data says no, we can't do this, And it drove me crazy, because every time I tried to make an innovation, or what I thought was an innovation on the interface, they would start recording everything, measuring everything, and say, no, data says you can't put the button there because people don't look there. Or you can't, you need to make it bigger because people can't see it, and so on. The other part of the data is that thing of profiling the audience, so measuring them in terms of their usage, where they are, how long they spend, what their demographic is. So there's a huge amount of data out there that we can capitalize on as designers and design better reading experiences. And just on that point, I did listen to the data designers and the data scientists, and we did integrate their findings with the intuitive stuff. And after we launched redesigned the newspaper, our audience went up by 2 million within a couple of weeks. So it did work. So I think data is a really key piece for us as designers to incorporate. But I do feel that we have to fight our corner as well, because not everything can be quantified and analytic. There's also human emotion, which we can't account for with data. In terms of design, we need to be thinking about different formats, different structures. So again, we're stuck in kind of responsive design at the moment, and thinking about, legibility on screen. But I think we have to kind of move beyond that and think broader across the ecosystem of structures, and that we can design print, possibly spatial, word-based communication. So environmental, spatial, wearable, there's so many different things we need to think about. Discovery, again, one of the biggest problems with designing text is is discovery. So again, that's why people resort to things like Twitter to find an article, or that's why we have to create these ecosystems of discovery around any content that we have. And if you ask any publisher what their biggest problem is, it's trying to get eyeballs on their content and keep those eyeballs on the content. So again, pretty much I would say our discovery has dumbed down to be Google. It used to be if you didn't know, now it's like I don't have time to look it up. So discovery is a key thing in terms of engaging people in the reading experience. And then devices. So again, I think we're kind of moved beyond the screen now. So it's, my research was all around the screen, but now we're post-screen and we're thinking about, I think Google call it, there's 7 screens. We've cars, we've wearables, the environment, and all of the mobile tablets and so on. So again, if you think about the reading experience, it's going to exist in a very different form that we used to be familiar with. So I'm going to shoot through just 8 principles that I think, I suppose, pull from screen-based or digital reading and from traditional print-based reading, and get you thinking about them in terms of your own reading experience. And if you're designing text-based content, which undoubtedly you will in some form or another, to think about how these might apply. Okay, so the 2 killer devices of the last century and this century, most definitely the codex and the phone. And I don't know what the next one is, but certainly these 2. Is the phone, the smartphone, is it going to be around for 500 years? I don't know, but these are definitely the 2 best reading technologies or killer devices that we have in terms of reading. So, and again, I think one is perhaps closed and one is open. And let's just think about it. So the physical form of the book is predetermined. It's great technology. We know, we understand it because we've got a culture of it for 500 years. But it's also, it creates a contemplative space where we sit down, we read, we think, we learn, and we research. On the other hand, we have the phone, which you can pretty much do everything on. So you can read on your phone, but you can also do all this other stuff. Now you'll see I've crossed out eat and travel. You can't actually eat your phone, and you can't eat anything that comes out of your phone, but you can order food on your phone, which you can't do with a book. So it's like you can't take photos with a book. So you can see that there's these 2 devices obviously are, they're very, very different, but I'd say the phone is one that we use a huge amount to read with. How many people in the room have read a book on their phone? Okay. So that's about the statistics. So again, the Pew Center of Research in the States, they did a study of reading, and they said that 30% of people had read a book on their phone. Now, the only book I read on my phone was Stephen Fry's book, which I did find quite difficult to read. How many people would say they read deeply on their phone? They'd read like a full article on their phone every day? Okay. Okay. So a good maybe 50% or more of you will read an article, but only say 30% would read a book. So phones are getting bigger. So it's likely that there's going to be more of you reading books on your phone. However, what I would say about the phone is it's almost there's an American psychologist called Barry Schwartz, and I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's written a book about the paradox of choice, which is this idea of when you present so much choice to somebody, it's like they're paralyzed. They don't know what to do. And that often happens, I think, in the case of you've so much stuff on your phone and so many options here that you can't read on it. And that's why you have a separate device called an e-reader, which just focuses on the reading experience. Because you're like, I can read here in peace because I won't be getting an email stream interrupting me, or I won't be getting Twitters, or I won't be getting, messages and so on. So I think that kind of paradox of choice has created a kind of an anxiety around so much information, and the habit that people form when they're reading on their phone is that it's more. It's like, oh, just another click and I could get a better thing, or I could get a more, up-to-date article, or I could get more. So it's distracting. Um, Secondly, this idea of a book having a finite amount of information. So again, if you think about reading, when you get a book, or at least years ago, I was teaching, the history of graphic design. Philip Megg's book was succinct. That was it. That was the definitive book on the history of graphic design. It had the content, and we could be confident that it covered all the eras. Now, if you put in history of graphic design, I mean, you can see there's 186 whatever million, blah blah blah, in a couple of seconds. So the sort of the difference here is like this is an infinite amount of information that's out there on the internet, versus a book. So in terms of reading, if you're a student and you're trying to research an area, or even if you're anybody here is doing research for work, or you're doing research for a book, or whatever, a project, anything, you start on the internet, and this is where you're going to end up with this, vast, infinite amount of information. And you've got to go through a process of qualifying that. And the process you do of qualifying, you start saying, well, if I look on Amazon, this one is the most current one, and people who are reading this are also reading this. So you're looking at the popularity stakes. So again, it's this thing of like more information, keeping us scrolling, keeping us looking for more information. And what that does is it denigrates your reading experience, your ability to focus, your ability to read deeper. So it becomes about collecting. So how many people have gone online and have started to research, and you're bookmarking and you're collecting stuff, and then you're like, oh shit, I can't remember what that article was about. And so it becomes all, instead of actually reading something and taking it in, it becomes about collecting, and we become like these kind of digital magpies. We're just squirreling away volumes and volumes of content instead of actually reading it. Okay, so I am talking about reading, so I am talking about privileging text, word-based communication over visual or rich media communication. But that would be, I'd be like an ostrich if I was to stick my head in the sand and say that, text is on the decline, okay? And, even though we're generating more text, online than anything else, it's still on the decline in terms of consumption. So the most consumption happens on YouTube, after a Google search of a text string. But in terms of consumption, we're turning to audiobooks, we're watching YouTube videos, so nobody reads an instruction manual anymore. You just look at the video of how to do it because it's much easier. So what's the point in having any text at all? Do we think there's any point in having text? For programming? Yeah. So the text in videos. Yeah, caption. But the point is, many of us are consuming audio and video, and we're not really reading anymore because we don't need to. And now we're looking at, voice-based user interfaces as well. So everything is changing. I mean, chatbots are probably going to become big in terms of interaction, but they'll soon be replaced by audio. So I'm going to tell you why I think text is worth keeping around. Okay, it's been here a long time, but I think that words are they're very objective in the sense, and they're very exacting. So we can write down what we mean, and we can be quite explicit about it. Now we can also be implicit, but we can write down what we mean, and we can have layers and layers of meaning that we can explain through text. And it's objective in the sense that it's abstract. Okay, so it's not figurative in the way that an image is, the way that a sound is. So we don't infer our cultural baggage onto those words per se when we start to read them. So, you're judging me by looking at me and listening to me. But if I was a piece of text talking to you, you would have less to judge because the text is abstract. Okay? So again, it's that thing of, you read a book and you infer in your mind the pictures, and it's individual to you. Whereas when you see the film of a book, it's done for you. So there's the kind of a passive aspect whereby it's presented to you. It's there, and it's I suppose all of the layers of meaning. So again, if you watch TV and you watch films and you've read a book of the equivalence of it, you'll see perhaps that how filmmakers try to infer meaning through tone, through light, through symbolism, whatever. But again, that's implicit and it's open to interpretation. So I think text is really, really good at some things. It's really good at detail. It's really good at specificity, and it can be objective. So I think we should keep it. I also think it encourages critical thinking, and it encourages to contemplate things and to reflect in a way perhaps that image-based communication doesn't. So we know that infographics and data visualization have become really, really popular, and they're a great way of taking very complex ideas that might have taken acres of text to explain and short-circuiting them to make them understandable to us, and that is brilliant. But it can also, again, lead to that thing of where we don't go deeper. So we think we're an expert because we read an infographic which gave us all the basic stats, but we don't really delve much deeper than that. However, I think in the context of what I've been saying about information overload, we need these types of approaches to help us cope. So I mentioned earlier I did a PhD on screen typography, and this is a visualization of my literature review, which, because at the time when I was doing it, it crossed over traditional practice, it crossed over a whole load of different areas, that I was reading material from all over the place, and I felt quite schizophrenic when I was trying to, sort of take knowledge from different places and put them together. And being a designer and being a visual person, what I started to do was to map and to visualize that knowledge. So again, it's nothing new really, but I guess the point I'm showing you here is that through kind of using techniques from maybe the digital world to help me understand and process information like visualization, you can apply it over text content that's complicated and deep, and then draw down into it in terms of meaning. So the literature here was stratified across 10 areas for and about practice. So one was theory and one was actually about the practice. And in doing that, then I began to highlight relationships in the literature, and then here is what's highlighted here in black is the link from I suppose typography to the School of Design in Basel in Switzerland, and center in there is Emil Ruder, who's this Swiss typographer and teacher, and he became a central tenet of my my PhD in terms of being applicable to screen typography. So really it was through visualization. There was a massive data here, and then just by visualization it would help me to uncover layers of meaning. I don't know if you're familiar with Spritzing, but I think this is quite an interesting experiment in terms of reading. So Spritzing is one word at a time based reading that uses the concept of ORP, or optical recognition point. So it centers the word. You'll see there where the red is highlighted on the word. And what it does is, again, there's been a lot of scientific testing around it, but would you believe it's 15% faster than normal reading, which is based around rapid serial presentation. In other words, a line of text and where we jump along that line in sachets. And yeah, so again, can you imagine reading a novel one word at a time? Do you want to have a go? So let's have a look here. And the Financial Times have done prototypes with this. You can do it, right? Now here's the thing. Whoa. I'm scared by this, I have to say, because I'm imagining my kids going, "I'm reading, Mom. I'm doing my homework." Yeah, and they'll have their phone in their other hand, or God knows what they'll be doing. However, so yeah, one word at a time reading is pretty impressive, and you actually can read it if you saw that, so you should give it a go. But God, I can't imagine reading a novel like that. And also, the thing about this, why it works is there's no pre-planning in terms of, the way you normally read, you're lining up, your eyes are skimming along, so you're jumping. It's got to do with your pre-recognition of the next word that's coming. Whereas here, your eyes aren't moving, you're just focused on it's going da 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 da. So if we were to evolve in, I don't know, 20 years time, and all we've done is stare at one word going da 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 in front of our faces, I wonder what effect that would have on us. Okay. So, fourth area then, narrativity versus interactivity. So again, this is a classic old argument, that old horse chestnut that we have from years ago. It's like, oh, can a narrative ever be interactive? Oh yes, games have interactive narratives, and they're the most engaging medium on the planet. Oh, films are actually interactive, you know. So that's just a circular argument that goes around and around. But what I will say is that narrativity, the emphasis on storytelling, and predominantly it's, you know, I suppose the one that we're used to is the book, which is a standard interface that's been around for, as I say, 500 plus years. Whereas interactivity, in terms of its physical, whatever interfaces, in terms of interactivity, it's non-standard and it's changing all the time. Now we do have standards in that touch is probably has become probably the most prevalent one. Voice is looking like it's going to be the next one, and then perhaps gestural with, you know, VR. However, so there is no standard interactive interface. And if we think of that in terms of reading, again, you know, I've only started doing experiments with virtual reality typography, or thinking about autofocus, you know, so you walk towards words and they start to focus, and stuff like that. So there's so much to be done in terms of experimenting with interactivity. And it's really depending on the device used. But I think whatever device we use, I think we have to think about, there's been things that have been around for 500 years, like storytelling, which engage the audience. And I think we have to look at ways that we incorporate those in. This is a few years old, but it was an iPad app that I designed for the London publisher Faber and Faber in the UK, with a company called TouchPress. And has anybody here studied English Lit? Okay, so you may be the only person in the audience who knows T.S. Eliot, the poem, and The Wasteland. Or anybody heard of the poem, The Wasteland? Oh, cool. Okay. Well, it's an incredibly obscure poem, but it is on most English Lit programs around the world. You will have heard of Ulysses, right? Has everybody heard of Ulysses? Okay. So if you think about Ulysses in terms of the novel, so probably The Wasteland is to poetry what Ulysses was to the novel. Okay. So it's a multi-voiced, layered poem about postmodern, I suppose, dislocation of urban man. Anyway, it's quite depressing, but it's a big classic out there, and for years people have struggled with it in terms of trying to make it accessible. So the task I had was designing this iPad app, and what we tried to do was to keep the reading experience of the poem core to the app, but to try and make it explicable through interaction. And what I would say is the focus here was not to make an app about the poem; it was to keep the poem front and central. So it was to try and force people to read the poem. And the interesting thing about this was it came out about, oh, I don't know, it came out a short time after the iPad anyway, and it really took off. It was the best-selling book on the iPad, and it even got a review in the Financial Times in terms of just what people were paying $11.99 or whatever it was at the time for it, which was a lot of money for an iPad app, because as you know, digital content or digital books people don't value in the same way as they do with a weighty monograph they can take home and put on their coffee table. Okay, so just very quickly, I just thought I'd show this because, again, it's not revolutionary, but what it does is it takes on board some of the kind of what I would say the traditional good things about the reading experience to engage the reader, and some maybe new things. So here's an example. Down the side here, you have a little visualization of the entire text. So it enables you to navigate, where you are at any point. We included a video performance, which again, as Fiona Shaw, the actress, as she recites the poem, the text highlights at the same time. So you have this all the time linking with the rich media to the core primary text. over here you can invoke notes. So again, anybody who's studied, the notes about the text, which is the annotations explaining each line. Again, with a simple touch, you could invoke those notes to the side, but always keeping the core text in. So I'll just show you a little sample of it. Oops. And again, the typography, it's a Scala, which is a serif typeface designed by the Dutch type designer Martin Mazur. So maximum legibility on screen.
Whether your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you,
This is Alex Guinness.
I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Frisch weht der Wind der Heimat zu.
Der Heimat zu, mein irisch Kind, wo weilest du? You gave me hyacinths.
So again, it's nothing revolutionary here, but it's very effective. And the reason we know it was effective was because of the amount of feedback we got from the app. I mean, we were inundated with feedback about this app. This is the original script, so it's got again a very complicated story behind it. It went through many iterations, and a Hungarian poet called Ezra Pound edited it with Eliot. So you can invoke that by a touch. So you can kind of see the history just by touching the text. You can invoke this, and it works in portrait and in landscape. So again, it's just very simple, but it's augmenting the reading experience on the screen without taking away and hoping to pull the reader deep into the text. Okay. Yeah, that's just showing you the visualization. I don't know if you can see it on the screen. It's very faint. But anyway, so you can just, again, you can hop to any part of the poem. And that it gives you that sense of you can see the whole thing, but the individual page then as well, which can be quite difficult to achieve on the screen. And then just in turn, we shot this video of Fiona Shaw in a house in Dublin. You can see that the header also acts as a navigation in the way that it does in a traditional book.
The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank, dragging its slimy belly on the bank while I was fishing in the dull canal on a winter evening, round behind the gas house, musing upon the king, my brother's wreck, and on the king, my father's death before him. White bodies naked on the low dam. They washed their feet and soda, water, oh, ces voix d'enfants chantant de la coupole, tweet, 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 chug, 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 chug.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. So what I'm trying to say is that we can include rich media in our reading experiences, but let's not lose the richness of the primary text. Let's kind of build and support around the primary text. Okay. So I guess another principle I think that we need to consider about sort of digital reading versus paper reading is books are good. Cognitively, books are really good for learning and understanding and reflecting on information. And screens are also good, but they're also difficult because what happens is in a screen, everything is stacked, okay? So you've got one little window and everything is condensed. It's like all those tabs you have open, boom, 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 they're all stacked up, okay? And you can only see them kind of one at a time, okay? So cognitively, we like to spread things out. How many of you work and put stuff up on the wall in your office? Okay, so why do you do that? So you can see the big picture, okay? If you're reading a science textbook on your iPad, which many schools, by the way, in the States and in Ireland, I don't know what it's like in Poland, but I know in Ireland now many schools are introducing iPads because textbooks are so heavy. The kids are breaking their backs going to school, so they're giving them an iPad. But the way they're learning is completely different with an iPad because they can't spread out the book, and flick between the pages, Yeah, sure, they can go menu, and bookmark a page, but it's a different experience. So cognitively, they can't sort of spread out their thinking. Okay, on an iPad it's all stacked. So it's this concept of simultaneity versus singularity. In a book you can kind of simultaneously flick. You can see it. It's physically in your hand. You can kind of see the text in its entirety. A little bit like what I was trying to do in the wasteland. You could see the whole text. You can orient yourself and you know where you are in relation to what you learned before. Much harder to do that when you can only see one thing at a time. And again, if you think of it like a map, you know, it's hard on an iPad to read a book when you can't kind of zoom out and see the whole world. You can with this concept of the infinite canvas there. And then just to kind of give you an idea, this is me doing one task relating to this talk, okay? I think it's one task, and this is one task. So I am not behaving in a kind of fractured, distracted manner here. I'm sort of focused, but I still manage to have 46 tabs open in my browser, 41 slides in PowerPoint, 12 Photoshop files, 85 images and photos, one QuickTime video, and I have 3 windows open on the iOS. Now that's just one little, what I would say, very calm and focused activity. Okay. Now you extrapolate that out by what you normally do in a day, and you have all your emails and you have 3 projects on the go, and God knows you're probably Skyping and meeting, and you're watching your Slack feed, and you're watching. I mean, is that a fair? Would that be fair in terms of if you were to reflect on how you're interacting on screen? So what you're doing is you have this crazy multitask, fractured kind of context switching going on all the time. And what that is doing is that is changing your behavior, and that relates directly to how you read, because your attention span is diminishing. So again, just the physicality versus virtuality. And again, this is totally changing now with smart objects. And we're going to have, I hope to God, smart paper. It is kind of there, but like the codex, as I said, it's a brilliant interface, you know, flicking through a bunch of pages, and, you know, we've learnt it. It's really, really good. So I think, you know, we should be thinking about it. How do we make the pages dynamic and change the content in there? That's happening, and there's lots of technologies. There's e-ink, there's liquid text, there's lots of things coming down the line. I don't know if you've tried this out. Has anybody tried this out? Liquid text? Okay, you should try it out. It's a really interesting way of annotating and clipping, but using your fingers. So it's almost like if you had the Surface to use it, you know, you could move stuff around, move documents around, and it feels like tactile. It feels like the way you want the reading experience to be digitally, with the smarts of digital, but with the benefits of the analog world. Okay, I'm getting close on time now, so I'm gonna wrap. So just again, in terms of reading into the future, you know, obviously I'm of a certain era. I'm BC. I was born before computer, before internet. But but I do like books, and I have loads of books at home. And but my kids are like, you know, I can't imagine they're going to collect books in the same way. I buy them loads of books, and they've loads of you know, children's books and so on. And I've loads of books in my house, and they take up lots of room. But in the college where I teach, our librarians are getting rid of the print collection, because they've nowhere to put it. So what they're doing now is they are subscribing to e-content. So basically our library has become just full of e-content, which is rented. Okay, so in our library we now no longer own any books, any content. We just rent it. And what that means is there's no return on our investment. So even if we spend, you know, the college can spend in 20 years' time, they'll have been paying an annual subscription for books. But if that tap turns off or the funding gets cut, that investment will yield nothing at the end of it. So all that money that has been spent, we've got access to that content for that period of time, but it's not there anymore. So again, you know, so I'm giving out about buying, you know, we're giving out about having to pay, you know, rent ebooks, but what have you got left when you stop your subscription and they're gone? We don't have a way of preserving our books. I mean, some of the best books in the digital canon of digital reading experiences are gone into the ether, okay? So these are John Maeda's reactive books, which I bought when they came out back in the day, and they were on a little tiny disc, and I had to get them from a Japanese publisher, and they're in our library in the college, but they can't be played on any device. Okay. Now John Maeda has got videos of these on his website, but that's the preservation order on this digital book, this digital artifact. Equally, this is David Small's PhD, which is a Talmud project, and it's, you know, and also Lisa Straussfield's project. And these are really interesting digital reading experiences, but they're gone. They're into the past, you know. So once something is so our canon of digital books or digital reading experiences, we've no way to preserve them really. The only constants are the web, perhaps in the cloud, but it's what we consume them on is a problem. And then finally, just thinking about personal versus personalized. So again, you know, years ago you get a book and somebody would write a little inscription and it was really personal and it was that thing, it was yours. Now it's about personalization, which is impersonalization in many ways. So again, you know, what I said earlier, it's like, you know, this behavior that we're cultivating, which is the grass is always greener, keep going, there's just another article that's going to give me the bit of knowledge that I need, and click, 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 and there's something on Twitter, and da, 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 da. So we are looking for different ways to find content to read, and personalization is about making content that suits the audience, or seeing what their peers are reading, or what's popular. So we need a little bit of that, but we also need a little bit of the other thing, which is really personalized. Some of the interesting examples, Medium is probably, I think, one of the really interesting examples about writing and reading going forward in terms of personalization, because the audience feels invested in the content, in the stories, and in their own interest. But if you take something like Mashable, which is hot, rising, and new, that's the currency in terms of reading an article. And you can see there 3.5k shares. Do you see that? That's what's going to make you read it. It's got nothing to do with whether you think it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's got to do with this perceived currency that makes people read that. So it's like follow the crowd. Okay, so finally, just going back to the things I spoke about at the beginning, I think we need to think about the access modes for reading. So again, you know, pinpointing audiences with data and creating an appropriate reading experience for them is something that we need to think more about if we want to really make personalization and sort of capitalize on the data. And, you know, based on where they are, their time, their place, their mood, maybe we can adapt the reading experience to them. You know, what they're in the mood for, whether they want it to be guided or exploratory, or whether it's research or contemplative. Engagement modes, again, we need to think about attention, conversion to deep reading. So again, you know, whether you're researching or so, perhaps when you want to engage with content, you can choose, I want to just have text only, so I can just, you know, be totally focused and blur out everything else, or I want to enrich it with audio, you know, that you can actually step up your experience and have a palette of engagement modes to choose from. I think you need to think about designing for, again, that concept of publish once, you know, to many platforms, but we are actually going to have to reimagine how we read, because we will be reading with visors in front of our eyes. So, you know, we laugh that we multitask now, but you'll be walking to the train in the morning and the news will be flowing in front of your eye as you walk along. That's worrying, or that's brilliant. I don't know what it'll do to our physiological selves, but anyway, or you'll be listening to it. So text is going to be mediated to us in ecosystems, in wearables, in physical devices, spatially around our home, and we need to think about how we design for those. And then just in terms of the ubiquity of text, I think we have to think about sustainability, because truly, going forward, at the moment, the only thing that seems to be sustainable is that the internet, the web, is still in existence, and we can put stuff in the cloud and we hope that it's going to be there. But in terms of the physical devices and their obsolescence, that's a real problem, I think, for artifacts. So finally, what does it look like? Well, as I say, these are a couple of my students here. One has a headset, the emotive headset on, and she's making a project to move things with brainwaves. We've been experimenting with, as I say, virtual typography. So these are only things that kind of we're starting to look at. The picture on the left is from Microsoft Labs, which is about this idea of having a smart newspaper which you could scroll, but it's actually tactile. And I love that idea. I think that's kind of interesting because I think the physical interface of paper is great. So there are many, many things to think about. I hope that's given you some food for thought. And I would say that, yeah, I think we have to acknowledge and accept the fact that your mind expects information now the way the net distributes. So we are moving swiftly, in particles, and that is just a fact. It's happened. It's done. So we need to think of how do we claw back some of our deep reading, deep thinking, and put it together with this crazy world that we live in and make new reading experiences. Thank you.
Thank you.